And they do say things like, diversifying our energy sources, better interconnection within Europe, lowering the carbon content of our fuels. And like at the same time, we're striking trade deals to take, I mean, there is also nuclear energy in that trade deal, but we're striking trade deals to effectively take on more fossils, right? Not less fossils. So I guess like in my mind, there's just this like overarching question, right? Of like, how does the trade deal actually fit within like a 2050 like carbon neutrality target? Right?
Hey everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Common Ground. As always, I'm your co-host Deb Ryan, and joined by Teresa Hartman. How are you,
Hi,
Teresa?
Deb.
Good to see you. As always, before we get started, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes. So, Teresa, we're going to jump right in. How have you been?
Excellent. I love how we unofficially actually start this podcast where Deb goes like, Teresa, are you ready? And I'm like, no,
No,
absolutely not. But let's do it.
we've
It's
got
like
lots to talk
the,
about.
it's the beauty of this podcast where
Yeah.
Deb's just like, let's go on this crazy journey together.
And I mean, we were talking about it in the green room, but there is still so much that we've got, going on and things like that, not just with work and the things that we're doing, but in the like policy and all this kind of stuff more broadly. And we finished last week's episode starting to talk about some of the US tariffs. And so we thought this week we're going to pivot and we're going to talk a little bit more from the EU perspective. But we wanted to sort of start with the EU US trade deal that was announced. And there's been a couple of iterations since it was initially announced. A lot of big promises, a lot of big discussions around what's going to be tariffed, how much energy the EU is going to buy from the US and stuff like that. Like, Teresa, I'm going to kind of throw to you, like, sitting in Europe, like, what are you hearing about it? What are some of your key takeaways as you sort of start to see this unfold?
Yeah. What are the takeaways? I don't know. I mean, I think the main takeaway is like this wasn't planned, right? Like we didn't go in, like the EU didn't go in and say, hey, we absolutely need a new trade agreement with the US, right? Like that was very much US driven. It was driven by tariffs being imposed. And then I think this like emergency negotiation of like, what can we actually mold and shape that is on the reasonable or on the workable side, right? And like I think where it came out, so this kind of like, we're going to impose like 15% tariffs, or most favored nation status, right? Like whichever one is higher. And then that is now applying to, I mean, in stages, but like in stages, those 15% are going to apply to like aircraft and eventually automobile and pharmaceutical as well, right? So like it's kind of like more consistent. I think if we stick to it, right, which is the big question, I think it's a more consistent approach than us sort of being at the mercy of like tariffs being imposed one week and then withdrawn and then imposed and then withdrawn. So big step forward to have.
Yes.
I know we're
Yes.
laughing. Big step forward to even have an agreement, right? So like I think that's good.
Yeah. And I think, there's, as it relates to things like climate policy, like there's things that are in this US EU trade deal, or EU US trade deal, depending on what side of the Atlantic you sit on. There's things like steel and aluminium and other derivative products that are included under the EU's CBAM or carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I talked about it at the top, but like energy's been a big piece of this. And we can talk about the absurdities of the amount of energy that's been promised. But the EU has very strict methane. There's a methane directive that puts reporting and future cost of methane onto imported fossil fuels into the EU. So the EU's been quite firm, actually, since this trade deal was signed, that they're not going to pull back on some of those things. So, like, um, I don't know, it's gonna be interesting to see, I think, like, I think maybe it's worth unpacking, like, what these cross-border trade policies, I think they're trade policies, but climate policies, actually kind of look like.
Yeah. Is it trade policy? Is it climate policy? Like was CBAM always protectionist, right? Or did it actually have a climate intention?
Yeah.
Um
For
yeah, let's
people that
recap
aren't
on the
for people that
yeah.
aren't familiar with CBAM, do you wanna give people a little bit of an overview, from your perspective of, like, what's been going on? And, like, I've heard bits and pieces about, is it gonna stick and stuff like that, but, like,
Yeah. So yeah, we should get back to the crazy energy story. But
yeah,
like
we will.
CBAM is the carbon border tax adjustment mechanism, right? So it's basically a levy on imported goods where the tax is being levied, or like the import tariff is being levied on the carbon content of the import, right? So like it covers CO2, it covers N2O, it covers PFCs. And in the transitional phases, there is basically just a requirement to report, right? So like if you're importing one of the materials that you mentioned, so like if you're importing cement or steel or aluminum, if you're or fertilizers, right? Like if you're importing those into
Fertilizers.
the EU, in the beginning, you just need to report on the carbon content, and then eventually you'd have to like purchase an ETS allowance for it.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet, right?
No.
And like at the moment, like that's sort of like the ring fence, right? And like I think the reason that it just came up in the context of the EU US trade deal is that in the trade deal we agreed to allow in a lot of goods from the US that maybe traditionally we haven't as much, right? So there's like we're actually allowing in a lot more agricultural products,
Mm.
which scares me for different reasons because like health standards in Europe are quite high, and in the US they don't always match what you would expect. But so it's basically Europe is opening up, right, to a lot of imports from the US, agriculture being one, energy being the other. And then there's this little provision of like, it's sort of like it's not a footnote, but it's sort of like a one liner where like steel, aluminum, and a few others that they mentioned, like derivative products will be ring fenced, right? And you're
Yeah.
kind of like, well, why is it being ring? What does it mean to be ring fenced, right? Like, is it ring fenced on both sides? Does that mean that we continue with CBAM? While also saying that like there'll be more flexible mechanisms around CBAM, and I'm just like, that's a bit open ended
Yeah.
at the moment.
It'll be interesting. And I think the CBAM piece, for me, I've looked at the steel piece in particular because the carbon
Yeah.
intensity that has to be reported, and that's just steel, just one example of one of the end use products that's covered by CBAM. It's a whole like life cycle carbon intensity calculation that for steel actually goes all the way back in some instances to iron ore pellets. And so you have to start looking at, okay, well, where was the iron ore that, where did the iron ore come from? And then where was the steel made? And then what's that emissions that's then being imported into Europe? And so suddenly in some circumstances, you've got 3 different countries that you've got to understand, like Australian iron ore into China for steel and then shipping and into the EU. And it's gonna be interesting to see. It is very difficult, and it's more difficult than I
It's
think.
really difficult, right?
Yeah.
Like carbon accounting along your value
Mhm.
chain when you have multiple suppliers or like multiple points of production in different countries, like it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Particularly for some of these very complex projects and products, I should say. And I think for me, it's always seems like a little bit of a protectionist strategy for the manufacturing that still does exist in the EU, um, particularly for end products, which CBAM covers. But it sort of always seems like a little bit of a protectionist trade strategy with a climate wrapper on it. I actually wrote a piece earlier this year that when the US was initially looking at just blanket steel and aluminum tariffs earlier this year, I was like, well, they could appease both sides and do a CBAM equivalent for the US, with all this
yeah.
stuff and, make the climate folks happy by actually calling it a carbon tax and not a tariff, but still it would just be a tariff. And actually, interestingly, there was some Republican senators, Lindsey Graham was one of them, but they'd actually co-written something similar a year before that I wasn't aware of. Someone sent it to me after I published my piece. But, um, you know, that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about blanket tariffs from the US. But like you said, having a little bit of stability, I think, is useful.
Yeah.
Switching. Oh, sorry.
Having the visibility, right? As in like what's gonna happen, when is it gonna happen, how high is the tax, right? And like I think that that is something that we probably haven't seen on either side, right? But like I think you can enter into like a very stringent, so for example, on the reporting front, right? Like there's all kinds of things happening in the EU. And like I think you can enter into like a very stringent reporting environment as long as it's very clear and it's phased and those phases don't move, right? And like what we're seeing right now is the opposite, right? Where basically like every phase, every deadline's being moved around in reporting guidelines.
I think one of the other pieces, and we can maybe talk about this a little bit later in sort of a broader climate policy, but one of the things that the CBAM has sort of forced the EU to look at again is the EU's been quite strict about the fact that under their emissions trading scheme, compliance obligated parties have to use allowances, and they're not allowed to use carbon credits and offsets and stuff like that, and carbon credits to offset their emissions. And if someone's used voluntary carbon credits, do they have to pay twice then? Because, so it's forced the EU to sort of look at if someone's offset their own emissions voluntarily for that steel or fertilizer or whatever it is, would they have to buy allowances as well? So it's sort of, there's been a whole kind of review of what the EU might look at. So I don't know, we can maybe talk about that a little bit more broadly in the climate policy kind of piece.
Yeah.
But it's been an interesting kind of discussion in that
Yeah, I
space.
feel like you absolutely would, no, because they're like two completely separate systems, right? Where
Yeah,
like under a cap and trade, like the EU ETS, you get allowances, right? Isn't like there's a certain number of allowances that are measured on the emissions that you're expecting for that time frame.
yeah,
And those allowances you can trade around, right? So like if you decarbonize faster than I do, I buy your allowances,
yeah.
right? So like that makes sense to me. And like the cap lowers obviously, which puts the pressure on. If you're operating in the VCM and you say, like even as a European steel producer, you might say, I'm forced to lower at a certain rate because that's just how the cap contracts. But you still might want to be ahead of the curve, right? Like you still might want to say, like, we're making carbon neutral steel or we're offsetting the entire energy cost of our production. Not that anybody's currently, but you could. You
Yeah.
could go that right? But like I think like whatever you're doing in the voluntary carbon market is always something that'll happen outside of this like regulated compliance
But how
scheme.
do
So
you think then, so like in the context of CBAM and the trade deal, so if you had a US steel producer, with which we don't have very many, US steel pretty much, and that's pretty much it, but we don't have a we don't have an emissions trading scheme here in the US. And so if US steel chose to buy voluntary carbon credits because there is no emissions trading scheme, would they then have to, if they could prove they'd bought credits to offset their emissions when they imported that steel into the EU, should they have to but then buy allowances at the border? And that's been a big question of like, will those voluntary credits for import be recognized, or would that importer still have to buy EUAs, which is how the CBAM was sort of originally framed, was that it was like it was going to use EUAs like the ETS does. So
mm,
it's an interesting kind of
mm.
conundrum.
I mean,
So,
I would say nobody knows, right? Like, I genuinely cannot tell you what's happening next
mm,
in like EU sustainability because everything's been so volatile this year.
yeah,
But
okay.
like, so if we assume that we were like in a 2024 regulatory environment where there was a huge drive to like increase scrutiny on sustainability performance, and there was a huge drive, not always successful, but there was a drive to like create integrated directives, right? So like there was a claims directive and a consumer protection directive and accounting like a standardized reporting directive and like so if we assumed that you were striving for policy consistency, right? Then logically speaking, so like if you look under the SRS, like if you look at like how emissions are regulated to be reported in the EU, you report your whole life cycle, like scope 1 and 1, 2, 3 emissions, right? And you can't deduct any offsets, right? So like your emissions are your emissions. If you've purchased offsetting credits, like you can report, like you must actually report on them, right? Like you must say how many did you use, where did you retire, where did you buy them, where did you retire them, and so on and so forth. But it's not going to lower your actual emissions burden.
Okay.
So if we assume that we're moving towards like an integrated, logical, consistent policy framework, then I'd say no, absolutely not. Like you can't use your voluntary certificates and then say I no longer need an EUA because they are different systems and they're accounted in different ledgers. That said, genuinely, I mean that's one of the things that the trade deal says, right? Is like more flexibility on CSDDD, right? So more flexibility on disclosures, more flexibility on liability also, which I find quite surprising, right? Because
Why is that?
liability is legislated at the national level, right? So like I'm not
Okay.
sure how the EU Commission would. So it's a little bit like at the federal level saying that they're going to change California law. I'm like, if there are climate liabilities, for example, in France when you make false claims, so it's not like the EU Commission can just like undo that.
Yeah.
So yeah, TBD, right? But like the trade deal, I think like big picture is like it walks back a lot of commitments or like it suggests that it might be walking back and creating flexibility for US companies on a lot of these like regulatory commitments that exist in the EU.
Hmm. That's interesting. Because it seems like sitting in the US that the EU's like sort of standing strong on some of these commitments. But like, what do you?
Because of the methane thing? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, methane, I think in particular, because I'm obviously quite focused on the energy side of it. But
Yeah.
like, I'm curious what you're seeing, and we'll talk about the energy piece here in a little bit. But like, what are you sort of seeing with? You talked about like if everything was going the way it was going in 2024, and we're sitting here now in August of 2025. So it's what's kind of happening in the EU then under like what have you seen sort of with some of the pushback and the changes to EU climate policy and some of that kind of stuff more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big headline, and like we could spend an hour just on this, right? But like the big headline was omnibus, and it feels a bit like it
Explain to
sounds.
folks what
It's
that is.
like the bus came around the corner and hit us all in the like ran us all over. So we've all been hit by the omnibus. So basically, the omnibus was a package that was introduced into the European legislative process, and the goal was to it depends on how we frame this. The goal was to roll back like the burden of sustainability regulation, right? And like some of these things are actually really legit and like they should be happening. I think they're very reasonable asks. But it was probably poor timing. So Omnibus basically looks at CSRD, which is our reporting directive. It looks at the green taxonomy, right? So that's an investment framework. It looks at CBAM. And the very first thing that Omnibus did in the spring of this year was to stay the deadline, like the incoming deadline for companies to start reporting. So there was like the
Okay.
first wave of companies were already reporting, and the second and the third wave hadn't started reporting yet. And basically, there was like a fast track decision that was just like pushed through the process really quickly to say, like, we're going to put off this reporting obligation until 2027. To be frank, because nobody knew how to do it, right? So,
Mm.
like,
Okay.
companies weren't ready. The guidelines on how to do reporting weren't out. There was no capacity. I mean, like, there's a few things where you really like,
That seems a little bit chaotic. Like, we're gonna make you do it. We don't know how. Just figure it out. With all this very
yeah, it was
complex
basically like the
stuff.
guideline on how to do it was going to come out in 2027, which they've now brought forward to 2026. But like, I mean, there's all kinds of good reasons why this it wasn't going well, right? Like there
Yeah.
was no capacity building. Companies didn't know how to do it. The administrative burden is really high. We've just talked about this, like trying to trace your emissions through your value chain is really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So there was a huge amount of industry pressure, right? Like understandably onto national governments and onto like the EU legislative bodies to say that it's not that this is generally a bad idea. It's that it's too complex, the burden is too high, and the deadlines are too soon, kind
Yeah.
of thing. Um,
It makes sense.
so overall, yeah, it makes sense, right? But like I think overall, what Omnibus has done is that it's now introduced, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, is like I think it is possible to operate well even in a high regulatory, high administrative burden situation, if you know exactly what's going to happen and somebody's given you the guideline and somebody's done the capacity building.
Yeah.
I think what's happening now is that like the deadlines have been put off for another 2 years. The guideline publication has been brought forward by a year, which we don't know if they're going to meet it. And then there's this whole package of substantive changes,
Mm.
right? So, like, for example, like there would be less reporting requirements on the taxonomy. You run a financial materiality assessment. If it's not material to your business, you don't report on it at all under the taxonomy. Kind of like similarly, like they're trying to reduce the reporting burden under CSRD. So
Okay.
the carbon disclosures, where like
Yeah.
you only do it if the company has more than 1,000 employees. And like that really brings down, right? And then there's like simplified impact assessment. So it's just like less paperwork if you don't
Yeah.
have to do it.
Makes
So
sense.
like in general, I think it makes sense, right? Like it makes sense to say like only companies of a certain size do this, and then there's a trickle down effect because at some point, like the larger companies are going to, at least in an economic ecosystem like Germany, like they are going to request information from smaller companies, and those smaller companies then do need to look at their own like footprint, right? Because they have to report back. So like I think in general, this makes a lot of sense.
Well, that's good.
It's just yeah, like I think in general, but what I'm trying to say is like this is where they should have landed 2 years ago,
Yeah.
right? When they like made a proposal and it went for public comment, all of this was known. Like none of this is news, right? And like, so instead of like taking in feedback from the public consultation and writing something reasonable, it was published in a form that probably wasn't achievable. Very ambitious, but probably not achievable.
Yeah.
And then taken back. But no, they haven't actually taken it back. They've only stayed the deadline, and the substantive changes didn't go through the parliament. So
Yes.
we're still hanging in
In this
balance.
sort of weird kind of balance and stuff like that, and it's like,
Yeah.
I think there was a word there that you said that I think is that I wanna pull out, and it's ambitious, right? Like, because there's no problem, I don't think, that there's any issue with a government or a company trying to be ambitious to a certain extent, right? But it's what they then actually it's what they say and what they do, right? They could talk about how they want to be ambitious with their climate stuff, but still put something sensible in place that's achievable, but still talking about like this is what we would love to get to this greater kind of peace and almost trying to motivate and like inspire people to do better without necessarily, but still putting something achievable in place. Like those two things are different often. And it's not to say that we shouldn't aim high, right? But we also need to make sure that things are reasonable. So I don't know. It's just
I mean,
kind of
I
an
think
interesting
we should aim
observation.
high, right? But like, I think it's a timing.
Mm.
So you could say we published this thing in 23. In 25, it's going to start. It'll be applicable to the large companies that are more than 1,000 employees. Then you wait for the trickle down effect where all the SMEs are going to have to start reporting, right? And that creates its own capacity building and the own structures that happen like through little innovation centers, right? Where people will share best
Yeah.
practice. And then you say, reporting requirements for like wave 2 and 3 will apply eventually, but it's not in 25, it's not in 26, right?
Yeah.
Like you just
Let's
stay
learn.
that deadline. Yeah. Like you create a lag, right? Because like, I'm completely honest, like what I heard around like reporting was it was a bit depressing, right? Like really,
Yeah.
so like companies that I was working with that were kind of looking at like, here's the cost of like, here's the administrative cost of like implementing all of this, doing our footprint, like understanding all of our impacts. And let's look at the fines, right? So people really were playing that game of
Yeah.
like, if the fine isn't high enough, there isn't this incentive to even enter into the process. And I think that that's, if you start hearing that, you kind of know that something's gone wrong.
The system's kind of broken. So, like, thinking of thinking about that, like, company kind of burden and stuff, like, there's often then conversation of then that flows onto the consumers and some of that kind of stuff, and one of the things that I often hear criticized, in the US, and you hear it of the EU, you hear it of California, that, well, all this climate policy is just making everything expensive, it makes energy more expensive, and, the consumer's just gonna have to pay more. Like, do you think you said there'd been a big industry pushback around some of this stuff. Are you seeing in the EU consumer pushback against some of it because of prices, or do people point to the climate policy for increasing prices and stuff like that? Like, I don't know, what's your thoughts on that?
So. I mean, I think that it's mixed. I mean, as with everything in life, it's mixed. But like, I think that generally in the EU, consumers want better consumer protection. They want better consumer choices, right?
Mm,
Like, case in point, there's like a whole suite of directives coming in around like labeling of products and misleading claims. And I think that there's fairly broad support in the general public for wanting to have clearer insights into what they're buying,
mm.
right? As in, like, don't tell me my yoga pants were made from recycled plastic bottles. Tell me that, like, 30% of the material used in this garment actually was recycled, right? And the rest was
Yeah.
still, yeah. So, like,
Instead
I
of,
do
yeah, like
think that
that claim, like you said, like, oh, it's made from recycled plastic, but that might be like 1% or something. So it's like,
it
yeah,
might be
not
1%, but also, like,
not
I'm
transparent.
sorry, like, what's the energy footprint of doing that, right? Like,
Yep.
I'm always very, like, I'm very dubious, sorry to say, of recycled goods because I'm always like, well, how did you collect it? Where did you have to transport it to? How did you clean it? How did you like retreat the material and then transport it again? Right? I'm just like, I'm all for recycled materials. I'm just like, unless you give me
Let's
the
be
energy and
transparent
carbon
about it. Yeah.
footprint of that process, I'm like, it might be worse, you know?
Yeah. It's true.
Um,
It brings us, but yeah, there's a whole conversation that we should have at some point about the circular economy because I'm a big proponent of reuse, but like, yeah, I would agree. I don't know that the recycle piece necessarily is always true. to a certain
I
extent.
it might like, it
Right.
might be great, right? Like, I don't wanna like, I mean, that was sort of like my case in point for, like, I think consumers generally are really supportive of green directives in Europe, or more supportive of green directives in Europe than maybe in the US. But I
Right.
think that, like, it obviously, like, at some point it hits the wallet, right? So, like, there was a very infamous case where France implemented a carbon tax and it led to huge protests, right? Like the Gilets jaunes, like basically like stopped the country from operating because
Mm.
it was increasing the cost of transport, right? Because it was like a very real like fuel tax and like that was very noticeable. And I think like there are, like economically speaking, like you can neutralize the tax burden, right? Like you can say you increase like you create basically a carbon levy on fuels or on energy in general, and you say you offset that by lowering the tax burden elsewhere, right? Because like the revenue for the government's going to be the same, right? But
Yeah.
like I think it's important to make it cost neutral for the consumer so that if they have higher energy or transport or fuel bills, like that needs to come from somewhere, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't just keep increasing costs. So mixed, I think, is
Mm.
what I'm trying to say, right? Like
Yeah.
generally, I think there's wide popular support for green initiatives, but obviously nobody wants to go, myself included, like nobody wants to go bankrupt
Yeah. Just
trying
because
to comply.
yeah. And I think the transparency piece there, like you talked about, is key. So, like, talking about energy, it's a nice pivot back to we alluded at the beginning of this
Ooh, back to
trade.
yes, what's in the
Back
trade
again to
deal?
one of my favorite conversations. But yeah, so the EU's essentially agreed to buy $750 billion of US energy before 2028, which is insane. I went back and pulled some
Tell me
stats.
why it's insane. You were the first person who
Yeah.
said this to me, and
Um,
I was like, why is it insane though?
so I went back and pulled, and I've been hyper focused on LNG specifically. So I didn't go and look at oil and coal and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But last year, the US produced $50 billion worth of LNG last year. So if in 3 years there there's going to be some increases and there's more facilities coming online, but even if there was 60 billion or 70 billion, that's only 200-ish billion dollars worth of LNG total. Last year, the EU took 48%, I think. My numbers might be off. The EU took just under half. So even if the
Yeah.
US produced $200 billion in the next 3 years ish, somewhere between 150 and $250 billion worth of LNG because of new facilities. And if the EU takes half of that, that's only $100 billion worth of energy in that time frame. Oil's obviously a big piece that the EU also imports. And like I said, I did not check those numbers as well, but the EU is not the only country or region that buys US oil. So yeah, it's a large number that is unachievable in oil and gas production terms with what's being exported from the US,
So I find this
which is
really interesting,
insane.
right?
Yeah,
So it's really interesting. So the US has agreed. No, it's actually the other way around. The US hasn't just agreed to deliver this, the US is requiring the EU to
to
buy
buy it.
this,
Mhm.
right? It's minimum offtake, like, it's a target for an offtake. But it's and, like, from the European so after you said that, I, like, looked at it, and, like, it's not crazy from the European perspective, as in, like, we import more than half, like, more than 60% of our energy, right? And, like, a lot of that already comes from the US, and, like, I think that last year, like, our energy inputs, right? Like everything, not just gas, but like everything was something like it was north of $400 billion.
Yeah.
So I was like $750 billion over 3 years is reasonable, even with price fluctuations,
Yeah.
is reasonable, right? So just from like a demand perspective, I'm like, it's not crazy.
Yeah.
But you're saying from a
From a
supply
supply
perspective,
directive, it's crazy. So
so why is it there?
not sure. The thing that's really interesting, though, from a carbon perspective, is there's two pieces. There's the EU side, and we started talking about that, and there's also the US side. So one of the things that on the EU side that the EU's actually stood pretty firm, at least from what I've seen with reporting, is that, like we sort of talked about at the top, the EU in 2023 put in place a methane directive for all imported fossil fuels, so for coal, oil, and natural gas, which initially, and it started this year, importers have to report on the methane intensity of the fossil fuels they brought in. And again, back through the whole supply chain, all the way to the wellhead, because that's consistent with the type of reporting that an EU producer would also have to do. So they're trying to level the playing field there for producers, whether they're in the EU or if they're elsewhere in the world and importing to the EU. Um, so that in and of itself is challenging for the same reasons the CBAM stuff is. Um, but that reporting requirement changes then over the next few years to be a payment. Ultimately, in 2030, is a price on methane intensity, which is essentially a price on carbon of those imports. So that's kind of that's the interesting piece on that, because here in the US, we don't have federal regulations around, again, a price of carbon. We don't have an emissions trading scheme. We don't have a carbon tax. Interestingly, though, the US does have methane reporting requirements under
Mm,
the so, but a lot of those, and again, they haven't necessarily been rolled back. There was reporting about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now, that the EPA is going to, again, they're not going to rescind and pull back the methane requirements, but they are going to delay them. And it's going to be interesting to kind of see what happens, because if again, to meet this $750 billion EU demand, if assuming, right, all US fossil fuels went to Europe, which again is not going to happen, but again, assuming a lot of it goes to Europe, given that the methane requirement for oil and natural gas, and actually coal, which that's not even being talked about in terms of emissions and stuff to the same level as gas, is getting all the attention, which is why I've been focused on the LNG piece. Companies that produce fossil fuels, oil and gas in particular, are going to have their methane reporting in place to be able to demonstrate that they're doing this. And the reason that that's important, and you flagged this, and I think it's worth noting, is the penalties for importers are ridiculous. And I was having a conversation with a EU fossil fuel importer earlier this year,
mm,
and it's one of their biggest concerns. So
mm.
the
But the penalty is 20%
yeah,
of
revenue.
turnover,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly.
like,
For an
turnover, which
importer.
is because, like, I mean, I don't know what your margins are like in oil and gas, but, like, presumably, if you get fined at 20% of revenue, that might be more than your profits that
Yes,
year.
it's insane. So the penalties for this are, and that you made this comment around for the corporate reporting piece for companies, if penalty is less than the cost of doing it, then they're just going to pay the penalty.
But you're not gonna do it. So, like, this penalty is actually insanely
Crazy.
high, right? So you have a great incentive to go do your methane reporting.
Mhm.
But so my take on the methane reporting. So, like, you're saying there's a US standard in methane reporting that's gonna get delayed. The EU says that they're going to stick to the rules, right, which is something like 3% of methane content for imports.
Mhm.
And the reporting requirements for imports will apply as of January 2027. So if the US delays their reporting requirements, it means that companies then aren't ready to export because the EU is still going to require you to report on it.
Yep. It's going to be insane. I think what I'm seeing here in the US is that a lot of the companies, and particularly the majors, are continuing with their methane reporting programs and methane monitoring programs that they've had in place. They're not necessarily making a big deal about it, but they're doing it because they know they have to. The other big piece, so that's kind of the first bit. I think what'll be really challenging is it'll be for the smaller oil and gas producers, that again, that becomes a burden that maybe they can't afford. And so there's a conversation there about, like, okay, so if the big companies are all doing it and the small companies aren't, what does a EU importer, whether that's an LNG company or a trading company or whoever it is, right, that is actually paying and doing the importing across the Atlantic, they need to get that reporting from that producer. And so there becomes a price conversation, which we haven't seen play out a lot in the market just yet. But there's always been this conversation around the price of certified natural gas here in the US, where a company can verify and prove that they have methane reporting, that their methane is low relative to, industry, whatever that looks like, below the standard that is required. And I think what we'll start to see is, I don't necessarily think we'll maybe start to see price premiums, although that there is some sort of thought around that, particularly around data centers. And so that's a whole separate conversation of where where the US energy requirements on top
Need
of,
price premiums for transparency and reporting.
yeah, but there's potentially going to be a
Huh.
penalty if you can't prove that you have the methane reporting in place. A and someone that's buying your natural gas won't pay you the full amount because then they've potentially got to pay this crazy penalty to the EU. So it's the pricing piece of this because of some of the penalties will be the interesting piece to play out here. So
Yeah, like, do you have a bigger market to play in because you can still export to the EU,
yeah,
right? But then, like, so, like, as I was digging into this a little bit, and methane is not my regular stomping ground, but so basically the EU came out and, like, as you said, they said they were going to stand firm on the methane directive. So even if they are taking $750 billion in just gas or just coal or like whatever it is
for
that's
all,
coming in,
all of it.
right, they're not going to roll back this methane directive. They did say, well, they did. One unknown official who was quoted said that there might be flexibility created around reporting. And like at that point, I'm just gonna pause and say, so if we have flexibility, like if the requirement is the same, but we have flexibility around the reporting, then how do we even know how much methane was in it?
Yeah. And is it
Like
just
you can't
yeah.
measure what you don't like you can't measure what you don't measure, right? So it's just like we're just gonna say it passes?
It'll be interesting because I think again, it goes back to the, oh, my dogs have an opinion about that, but, like, it'll be
Ah,
interesting
good.
to it'll be interesting to see what goes back to the consumers, right? Like, you talked about the French protest where the cost of fuel for for everyday consumers, right? We see it here in the US as well. When the cost of fuel goes up, there's, like people are mad about it, right? Like, it becomes something that, changes political regimes and stuff like that because it has a direct impact on our lives. So it will be interesting, and I think Europe's always been in this bind where, you know, how do they make sure that the price of energy is something that's reasonable versus, what they're doing on climate policy. So it'll
Yeah.
it's gonna be interesting.
And bigger targets, right? So like we're not gonna have time to really dig into it, but like the EU has an overarching set of climate targets under the Green New Deal, right? And one of them is a 50% reduction by 2030, which we're actually on track to achieve, which is
Which is
pretty
amazing.
extraordinary. But there's a proposal for like a 90% reduction by 2040, which I don't think is going to happen if we continue importing fossils like this. But there's a whole suite of stated objectives in like the Green New Deal, but also in the Industry Transition Plan, and they do say things like diversifying. Our energy sources, better interconnection within Europe, lowering the carbon content of our fuels, right? And like at the same time, we're striking trade deals to take. I mean, there is also nuclear energy in that trade deal. Like we're
Mm,
striking trade deals to effectively take on more fossils, right? Not
yeah,
less fossils. So I guess like in my mind, there's just this like overarching question, right? Of like how does the trade deal actually fit within like a 2050 like carbon neutrality target,
yeah,
right? Or the other way around, like we're all waiting. We talked a little bit about CBAM in the beginning, right? And like we were all waiting. Like CBAM has a really limited scope right now, right? It's just on like materials and electricity and fertilizers. But there was meant to be a scope expansion. And like back to your question of like, was CBAM there to protect like the metals industry, or was CBAM there because it's truly a climate policy?
yeah,
And I'm always like, if CBAM is a climate policy, it needs to include fossil fuel imports,
yeah,
right? And like right now, it doesn't cover mineral oils. And like there was meant to be the scope expansion in 2030. CBAM was going to get expanded into like fossil fuel imports. Great from a climate perspective, not from a cost perspective. Great. Um, However, like what's floating around now in this like entire wave of revisions that we were talking about, like one of the revisions that's actually coming into the next legislative cycle is a revision of the scope expansion, right? So like I think between like the trade deal and the whole omnibus package, I think we can kind of read between the lines that CBAM's not gonna apply to
mm,
to fossil 2030, right? And like I think that there's just like a whole question around like the consistency of these policies between like
yeah.
the trade goals, the competitiveness goals, and the climate goals that the EU has.
Yeah. I think that might be a great place for us to wrap today. We've covered a lot of territory actually, but I think like you
So
said,
much
there's
ground.
there's more to come on the EU story, and particularly as we start to see some of EU already buys a lot of US fossil fuels and stuff like that. The piece again that'll be interesting on the demand side for fossil fuels is that the US also has an increasing demand for consumption given our data center electricity requirements. So that's
Mm.
also, that's a
We were
big
talking about that last time, how
yeah.
actually
So
a lot
that's
of that
also the other
energy is
piece.
going to be needed domestically, right?
Exactly. So it's going to be an interesting piece around like how much does the US consume domestically versus how much gets exported, and what does that look like, and what does that mean for producers and stuff. So it's again, a lot more to come in terms of this like moving policy and things like that. But yeah, Teresa, it's always as always, it's been fun. We went on crazy tangents, which is great. I love
We
it.
went crazy places, yes.
So
My
and
yoga
then
pants are not made from recycled plastic bottles.
right, that's a whole conversation we should definitely dive into, for
It's
sure.
a whole conversation.
But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and yeah, until next time. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you, Deb.